The population of South Africa during the 20th century was 75% black and 8% white, yet that 8% controlled 87% of the land and maintained almost complete control of the government. This imbalance of power stems from the European occupation of South Africa for hundreds of years. The Dutch first colonized this region, which was later taken by the British during the Boer Wars. While the British officially left in 1961, many of their white citizens remained. South Africa in the 1900s was deeply segregated. Native Africans were forced to live in designated areas and had next to no political power or upward mobility, making a truly integrated society South Africa's final frontier. Apartheid was a period between 1948 to 1990 when South Africa's white-ruled Nationalist Party took control of the government. The fight against this racist regime wasn't successful until the 1960s. When all hope was lost in the fight against apartheid, it was South African students that came together to create change. This was the first time in South African history that students came together to fight for their rights. These student organizations not only improved South Africa, but also inspired other student organizations that continue to impact South African educational rights today.
In 1924, the National Union of South African Students, or NUSAS, was created by white students to fight for student rights. White members became sympathetic to the black students' cause, but black members were a small part of this organization. In 1968, Steve Biko, a student at Natal University, criticized NUSAS and the political situation in South Africa. He created a new organization, the South African Students Organization, or SASO, an organization made solely of black students. Steve Biko and SASO members created the SASO Manifesto in 1971. They agreed that their main purpose was to work towards building a better life for the black people of South Africa. Their overall mission was to integrate all the people of South Africa, no matter their race. In December 1969, SASO decided that work among the people should be one of their primary occupations. Community outreach was important to SASO. Members repaired schools, built houses, ran literacy campaigns, held skills seminars, and volunteered at clinics.
SASO wasn't the only student organization fighting for South African liberation. There were other organizations during the 1970s. Steve Biko realized that the best way to make an impact would be to unite with the other organizations. So the Black People Convention, or BPC, was launched by Biko in July 1972, and it held annual conferences after that. By the mid-1970s, an increasing number of black students had become involved with SASO. They gained so much attention that the South African government passed the Affected Organization Act of 1974, which cut off foreign funding from SASO to restrict their activity. It also allowed the government to search, seize, and interrogate suspicious organizations. This, however, did not stop SASO from continuing its mission. SASO members continued to protest at universities, and as a result, most universities banned members from entering the schools and leaders were arrested.
So, clearly, youth and student movements have been important to any type of social change in the past.
In response to the restrictions by the government, SASO involved all members of the BPC in a large protest. On June 16, 1976, an estimated 20,000 students in the town of Soweto left their schools and marched in peaceful protest. Police arrived and began shooting students who would not disperse when ordered. Students and even parents continued protesting for the next 10 days. Police action against protesters resulted in 451 deaths and 2,389 injuries. Within 4 months of the Soweto revolt, 160 African communities from all over the country joined the resistance. It was estimated that at least 250,000 people in Soweto were actively engaged in the resistance, and SASO garnered the attention they needed.
In response to the Soweto uprising, the government banned SASO. In 1977, the government arrested Steve Biko and detained him at Walmer Jail in Port Elizabeth, holding him under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act. Biko was later tortured. He suffered severe head and brain injuries, and he passed away on September 12, 1977. A month later, SASO and other black consciousness movements were targeted under the Internal Security Act, which banned any organization that threatened the security of South Africa. However, this did nothing to diminish the fighting spirit of countless black students in South Africa.
Biko and SASO, that would have not been possible. The end of apartheid or the election in '94 were not for Biko's work, and particularly, unfortunately, from his arrest and then subsequent death. It motivated, I hate to use the word that motivated people, but inspired people. His work and his life inspired people to rise up against apartheid.
The students who weren't arrested were not frightened by the government's action and Biko's violent death. They used the past as inspiration to fight harder for their rights. They came together and started other student organizations. The largest of these new student organizations was the Azanian Students Organization, or Azaso. It was created in 1979 by Tom Kauna. Azaso was originally formed as a continuation of SASO. While Azaso looked to the SASO Manifesto for inspiration, members saw SASO's mistake and aligned themselves with the African Nationalist Congress, a social democratic party whose leader was Nelson Mandela. They decided not to follow the black consciousness doctrine that SASO and the BPC followed because the best way to achieve equality was to include all races, not just black communities.
Azaso was part of many movements in South Africa. They always aided the African Nationalist Congress in their actions. Specifically, Azaso cooperated with another new organization known as the Congress of South African Students, or COSAS, to work on two major charter campaigns. In 1981, these organizations committed themselves to the Freedom Charter. Most black people were predominantly working class. This meant that low wages, unemployment, and inadequate housing and services were realities for most black communities. So members involved themselves in the community campaign, conducting research and compiling information that enabled black workers in South Africa to get a better understanding of their situation and the inequality they were experiencing.
Their second charter campaign was passed in 1984. It was the Education Charter Campaign. In it, they laid out what an equal education would look like. The opening clause states that the doors of learning and culture shall be opened. Members of Azaso and COSAS shared this charter with black students across South Africa. This charter led to many more students to participate in these movements. In the same year as the passing of the Education Charter, Azaso, COSAS, and NUSAS came together to organize a countrywide day of solidarity at schools, universities, and colleges. This was the largest number of protests South Africa had seen. This day garnered significant international and domestic attention.
In 1986, Azaso, COSAS, and several smaller organizations combined and created SANSCO. They continued boycotts at universities. However, in 1988, after multiple movements, SANSCO was restricted under a state of emergency by the government. The government intended to ban the primarily black organization to stop the opposition to apartheid.
Student organizations and other organizations did enough to garner international attention, and the Nationalist Party released Nelson Mandela on February 11, 1990, after he spent 27 years in jail. Mandela, with the support of the African National Congress, decided to run in the 1994 election. The African National Congress garnered the support of South Africans with the help of the student organizations. On September 6, 1991, SANSCO and NUSAS merged to form the South African Student Congress, or SASCO. United, they became stronger and continued raising support for Nelson Mandela.
In 1994, Mandela defeated the Nationalist Party candidate, and apartheid ended. It was the youth of South Africa who fought for this change. They stood up to end a long period of segregation, and they inspired future generations of youth to fight for their ideas. When Mandela was imprisoned and hope seemed lost, university students from South Africa came together to fight for equality. Today, SASCO continues to fight for educational rights in South Africa. The legacy of SASO and other student organizations continues to live on in an integrated South Africa.
Sesingena kwamanye amazwe lapho kungazi